It was 7 days before Christmas when I first heard it. I was folding towels in the laundry room, the steam from the dryer curling up around my face, when Maddie's voice cut through the hum of appliances, casual and sharp, all at once. The greatest gift would be if you just died. I froze mid-fold, a warm towel slipping from my hands and landing on the floor. My heart thudded hard against my ribs, and for a long moment, I couldn't breathe. It felt as though every year I'd spent caring for this family, the groceries, the bills, the babysitting, the late nights listening to Maddie's complaints, had been nothing but a shadow beneath her feet. I had spent decades giving, bending, and swallowing my voice to keep the peace. And now the peace I had fought to maintain was laced with venom. I pressed my palm against the countertop, trying to steady myself. The words replayed again and again in my mind. My daughter, my child, the one I had carried for 38 hours of labor, the one who had called me her hero on her wedding day, had just said she wished I were dead. I wanted to scream, to collapse onto the tiled floor, but my knees wouldn't let me. I retreated slowly to the stairs leading to the in-law suite, dragging my legs like they were filled with lead. Inside my room, the one I was never allowed to decorate beyond a few neutral curtains, I sank onto the edge of the bed. I stared at the off-white walls and the small dresser, at the blankets, folded neatly in the corner, for when the grandchildren visited. My hands shook and my eyes burned, but tears refused to fall. I reached for the notebook tucked in the drawer, the one I kept for reminders and lists, and wrote down her words, exactly as I heard them. The greatest gift would be if you just died. I read it again, then again, trying to convince myself that I had misheard, but I hadn't. Every memory of sacrifices I had made the money I left in kitchen drawers. The houses I had helped buy, the late nights I had stayed awake listening to her worries flashed before my eyes. All of it, meaningless in a heartbeat. I sank back against the wall, my chest aching in a way that was both sharp and hollow, and felt a strange mixture of grief and clarity settle over me. For the first time in years, I realized I could no longer remain invisible. No longer let my life and my efforts be taken for granted. I closed the notebook slowly and breathed in, trying to calm the storm that had risen inside me. And then I knew, in that quiet, suspended moment, that something had to change. I had spent 3 years in this house, living in the small in-law suite at the back, a space that was always just enough to exist in but never enough to feel at home. I cooked, cleaned, and kept everything running, yet every effort seemed invisible. Maddie would stroll past the laundry room or the kitchen, eyes glued to her phone, barely acknowledging my presence. Her husband rarely spoke more than a curt nod, assuming my labor and care were expected, inevitable. I thought back to the months when I paid the utilities, covered groceries when money ran short, and left envelopes of cash tucked into drawers for emergencies. I had been the safety net, the quiet backbone holding everything together while they lived as if I were a stranger. Birthdays, holidays, school events. I managed them all, often at my own expense, often at the cost of my own comfort and dreams. I had smiled through it all, convincing myself that family meant sacrifice, but family hadn't meant gratitude. Not here. My suggestions were dismissed. I wasn't allowed to move the furniture, choose a paint color, or even decide when to host a dinner in my own space. I was careful not to overstep, careful not to rock the boat, careful to make myself small. In the living room, Maddie's laughter rang out over the television, and I imagined myself a ghost drifting through the walls, noticed only when something went wrong. I remembered times I had gently corrected the bills, offered advice on the mortgage, or tried to speak up about the children's schedules, only to be met with irritation or a cold glance. I had learned to fold myself away, like the towels I stacked every morning, perfectly neat, silent, and disposable. I sank into the small chair by the window, staring at the frost on the glass, thinking about the woman I had become, one who had given so much, yet was counted for so little. I had been unseen for years, a shadow in the corners of the rooms I had helped fill, and now, after what I had just heard, I realized that invisibility was a choice I could no longer make. The time had come to consider what I was truly willing to endure and what I would never endure again. Chapter 3: Eavesdropping and Realization. I wasn't meant to hear their conversation. I had only stepped into the hallway to grab a spare blanket for the grandchildren, and the door to the living room was cracked just enough for voices to drift through. Maddie's tone was casual, like she was talking about the weather or which holiday cookies to bake. But the words that followed froze my blood. It would be so much easier if she just wasn't here. Maddie said, her voice was calm, almost bored. We could have peace. Quiet. Finally, I stopped mid-step, gripping the blanket tightly, my knuckles whitening. I wanted to step into the room, to demand she stop, to scream, to make her see me. But something inside me told me to stay. I had heard enough. The betrayal hung in the air like a weight I couldn't move. Her husband laughed softly, a nervous, almost indulgent sound. Yeah, I know. It'd make things simpler. We could finally relax without worrying about her. I leaned against the wall, my back pressing into the cold wood paneling as the words sank in. He wasn't stopping her. He wasn't saying it couldn't be true. He wasn't even hiding his agreement. I had spent years thinking of him as a partner, someone who might at least recognize my effort and sacrifices. But here he was, complicit, silent in his approval. I thought of every time I had gone out of my way for them, helping with school applications, covering bills when money ran tight, staying up late to soothe crying children, arranging holidays so the family looked perfect. I had done all of it quietly, believing it was love, believing it was my duty, and now I realized it had been invisible, unnecessary, even a nuisance to them. I retreated down the hallway, gripping the blanket like a shield, my mind spinning with memories and the sting of betrayal. The anger inside me was sharp and steady now, replacing the initial shock with clarity. Years of being taken for granted, ignored, dismissed. They all led to this moment. I could not continue like this. I returned to the safety of my in-law suite, closing the door behind me. I sank onto the edge of the bed, letting my body sag with exhaustion. But my mind was alert, calculating. I knew then that I could no longer live unseen, no longer let them treat me as if I were nothing. Something had to change, and I had to be the one to make it happen. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands folded tightly in my lap, and let my thoughts drift through the years I had spent holding this family together. I remembered the envelopes of cash I had tucked into drawers when money ran low, the countless bills I had quietly paid, the groceries I had bought week after week, often skipping things I wanted for myself so they could have what they needed. I had thought of these as small sacrifices, as love expressed in the quiet work of everyday life. I remembered late nights comforting Maddie when she cried over a failed exam, the hours I spent helping her prepare for interviews, the winter mornings I drove the kids to school when she was too busy or too tired to care. I had planned birthdays, holidays, and family celebrations, spending money and energy I could have used on myself, all while telling myself that this was what being a mother meant. But now, recalling her words, I realized that none of it had mattered. My labor, my money, my time, my care, it had all been taken for granted, ignored, dismissed. They had treated me as if my presence was an obligation, not a gift. Every effort I made had been met with indifference or annoyance. Every moment I devoted to their comfort and convenience had been returned with disregard. I thought of the mortgage I had helped pay, the the repairs I had insisted on, the meals I had prepared, the nights I stayed up worrying about their lives while they slept in blissful ignorance. I had carried more weight than anyone knew, and now the person I had devoted myself to the most had wished I would disappear entirely. I felt a surge of something I hadn't felt in years, not just anger, but clarity. I could no longer let my care and generosity be exploited. I could no longer let their sense of entitlement dictate my life. The realization burned through me like a spark in dry leaves. If I wanted to survive, if I wanted to reclaim my dignity, I had to take action. I had to protect myself, not just for my own sake, but for the sake of the life I still had left. I leaned back against the wall, breathing slowly, letting the weight of my resolve settle over me. I would not allow my years of giving to vanish into nothing. Something had to change, and I knew that the first step would come tomorrow. The next morning, I returned to my in-law suite with a sense of quiet determination I hadn't felt in years. I sat on the edge of the bed, letting the events of the previous night replay in my mind, and my gaze fell on the small dresser in the corner. The drawer where I kept old papers had always been mostly forgotten, shoved to the side as if the years themselves wanted to erase their presence. I opened it slowly, my fingers brushing over yellowed envelopes and receipts I hadn't touched in ages. One envelope, taped carefully inside the lining of a small suitcase I had brought with me 3 years ago, caught my attention. The label was in Robert's handwriting, neat and precise. Plan B. My pulse quickened, but not with panic. This was different. This was possibility. Inside the envelope were documents I had long suspected existed, but never dared confirm the co-ownership deed for the house. Mortgage papers with my name still attached, and the details for a separate emergency account I had set up decades ago. Each piece of paper was a reminder of years I had ignored, of my own foresight and caution that had been buried beneath routine, politeness, and silent service. I spread the papers on the bed, smoothing out the creases. For the first time in what felt like decades, a calm washed over me. The panic, the helplessness, the feeling of being trapped, it was gone. I realized I held the power I had been seeking without even knowing it. The legal leverage to reclaim control of my life and my finances. My thoughts raced, not with fear, but with strategy. I could act quietly, decisively, and without the theatrics that would have once consumed me. I could plan, step by step, and let the consequences unfold without confrontation. The years of being invisible, of being used, suddenly seemed irrelevant because I was no longer powerless. I carefully refolded the documents, sliding them back into the envelope and tucking it under the lining of the suitcase where no one would notice. Outwardly, I would continue to move through the house as I always had, quiet, unassuming, but beneath the surface, a plan was taking shape. I felt a spark of something I hadn't allowed myself in a long time, hope, sharpened by resolve. Tomorrow, I would begin. The first step would be mine, and for the first time in years, I understood that the life I wanted had always been within reach, waiting for me to claim it. I woke before the household stirred, the quiet of early morning settling over the house like a soft curtain. I brewed a cup of coffee, the aroma filling my small suite, and opened the envelope I had tucked into the suitcase. The co-ownership papers, mortgage documents, and bank details stared back at me, reminders of the life I had built and maintained, only to be taken for granted. Today, I would act. I logged into the separate emergency account first, the one I had kept untouched for decades. I had learned long ago to prepare for the worst, to protect myself even from those I loved most. Slowly, methodically, I transferred the funds to a secure account that no one else knew existed. Each click of the mouse was deliberate, a small assertion of control that sent a warmth through my chest I hadn't felt in years. Next came the mortgage, I called the lender under my own name, verified the account, and arranged for the payments to be temporarily halted until further notice. No explanations, no confrontation. I let the legal weight of the papers do the talking. It was enough to make the house tremble beneath them without me lifting a finger in anger. I prepared the formal notices I would eventually deliver, detailing my intent regarding the house and my rights as co-owner. Each word was measured, unemotional, legal, undeniable. There was no malice, no need for theatrics, just the precision of boundaries enforced at last. Sitting back in the chair by the window, I felt decades of being unseen and unheard begin to shift. Every hour I had spent folding laundry they never acknowledged. Every bill I had covered, every meal I had prepared, they had assumed my presence was permanent, unchangeable, and free. Today, that assumption broke quietly, without screaming, without tears, without the need to beg for recognition. I poured the remainder of the coffee into my mug and watched the early light across the frost-lined street. A calm satisfaction settled over me, unlike anything I had known. For the first time in years, I was the one holding the cards. I didn't need them to understand, to apologize, or even to notice immediately. The consequences would unfold, and I would observe silently, firmly in control. The house would tremble beneath their entitlement before they even knew the ground had shifted, and I would be free to move forward on my own terms. Her husband, usually calm and dismissive, paced the living room like a man caught in a storm he couldn't navigate. Every glance he cast my way was laced with unease, a silent acknowledgement that the rules had changed and that I was no longer the one to be taken for granted. I stayed in my suite, keeping my movements quiet, letting their confusion and desperation unfold. Maddie's voice grew louder, more panicked, as she tried to marshal control, making phone calls, checking balances, and barking orders. She had always thrived on the assumption that I would absorb the mistakes, cover the lapses, and keep everything running. That assumption had just shattered. I could hear the anger shift, the frantic attempts to manipulate, the gasps of disbelief as they realized the emergency funds were gone, the mortgage on hold. Every last resource I had protected for them, now beyond reach. They were grasping at the edges of a reality they hadn't anticipated, a world where I was not their silent safety net. I poured myself a cup of tea, feeling a strange satisfaction mix with the calm that had settled over me. For the first time, I was invisible only in the way I chose, observed only the consequences, and remained untouchable. Their panic was the proof that the life I had maintained for them depended on my labor, my care, and my compliance. None of it could be taken lightly now. The house trembled under the weight of their entitlement, and I, for the first time in years, watched quietly from a distance as they realized I could no longer be controlled. I checked the airline account I had maintained for years. The points quietly accumulated and booked a flight to Florence. No explanations, no farewells. I did not look back. Though I imagined the chaos I would leave behind Maddie running through the house, bills unanswered, phones ringing, the sudden realization that her mother could no longer be her safety net. As I zipped the suitcase and lifted it onto the bed, a sense of calm settled over me. It was not the relief of escape, but the quiet satisfaction of finally claiming control. Every step of the planning, every decision to prepare, every measure I had taken in secret had led to this moment. I walked through the empty house one last time, the familiar walls and furniture now strangers. I did not feel regret or fear, only a steady certainty. I would arrive in Florence and take possession of a life that belonged to me. The freedom I had earned through years of endurance finally tangible. I locked the door behind me, suitcase in hand, and stepped into the crisp morning air, feeling the weight of decades lift as I moved forward. Before leaving Chicago entirely, I took a moment to think of the grandchildren. They had no part in the bitterness that had grown between Maddie and me, and they deserved to know that my love for them remained unchanged. I found small, simple gifts books, a set of colored pencils, a few little toys I knew they would enjoy, and tucked them into plain brown paper packages. In each package, I left a letter, written carefully, with no anger or accusation. I told them how proud I was of them, how much I loved watching them grow, and how every choice I had made, even the ones they didn't understand, had been out of care. I reminded them that the troubles between adults were not their burden to carry, and that they should never feel responsible for anyone else's mistakes. Placing the envelopes beneath the Christmas tree, I felt a quiet satisfaction. This was a way to give, to protect, and to teach, without sacrificing myself again. My message would survive, carried forward in my absence, a reminder of love framed by boundaries. I took one last look at the living room, the tree still glowing faintly, and closed the door behind me, leaving the house and the life I had maintained for decades to face the consequences of its own chaos. The taxi pulled up to the small apartment in Florence just as the afternoon sun spilled across the cobblestone streets. I carried my suitcase inside, setting it down carefully, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't realized had been pressing me down for decades. The apartment was modest, but it was mine. Every key, every lock, every small detail belonged to me, and for the first time in years, I felt the quiet hum of autonomy. I opened the legal documents I had carried across the Atlantic one last time. The co-ownership papers had been processed, the mortgage settled, and the emergency account secured. All the debts I had once quietly covered were no longer mine to bear. I exhaled, letting the finality of it settle in. I had left behind the chaos, the demands, and the silent weight of being unseen, and in their place, I had something far more valuable: control over my own life. I sat by the window, watching the city blur by as I sipped tea, and allowed myself to reflect on the journey that had brought me here. I had been taken for granted, dismissed, and used, yet I had endured. And now I understood that love and care did not require self-erasure, that boundaries were not betrayal, and that independence was not selfishness, it was survival. I arranged my few belongings neatly, feeling a sense of satisfaction and quiet pride. For the first time, I was fully myself, and this was the life I had earned, the peace I had long deserved.